Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Western Flavors. Before we dive into our new episode, we must bear witness to the devastating and final fracture that occurred in our last story. We watched as Amy, armed with the terrible truth of her father's secret dealings with a predatory equity firm, confronted him in the heart of the Dude Ranch Lodge. The ensuing battle was not a shouting match, but a cold and brutal and surgical takedown, as Amy dismantled Tim's every desperate justification. The episode and their relationship ended in ashes, with Amy's final and heartbreaking and unforgiving words. "You didn't save us, Dad. You just sold us out." Now, in the terrible silence that follows such a war, the survivors must choose a side, and Lou Fleming finds herself trapped in an impossible and soul-crushing no man's land. The silence that followed Amy's departure was not a quiet thing. It was a loud and heavy and suffocating entity, a living presence in the room that was composed of the black and toxic and radioactive fallout of a family gone to war. Amy had not slammed the door. She had simply turned her back and walked away, a quiet and steady and final act of a severance that was more brutal than any explosion. She had left her father standing in the self-inflicted and pathetic and terrible wreckage of his own making, and the four people who remained were now the unwilling inhabitants of that ruin. Tim had collapsed back into the armchair, a deflated and gray and hollowed-out effigy of a man. The fire and the passion and the desperate and righteous fury that had fueled his defense were all gone, leaving only the cold and empty and desolate ashes of his defeat. He stared at the floorboards, his gaze unfocused, his entire body a monument to a pure and absolute and self-inflicted devastation. Lou stood by the kitchen counter, frozen, a statue of a pure and unadulterated and miserable shame. Amy's cold and unforgiving eyes and her own and cowardly and deeply incriminating silence were seared onto the inside of her eyelids. She was an accomplice, a co-conspirator by inaction, and the weight of that quiet and pathetic and unforgivable failure was a physical and crushing and unbearable thing. It was Ty who finally and irrevocably broke the terrible and profound and absolute spell. He had stood silent, a grim and stoic and deeply formidable guard by his wife's side throughout the entire and terrible ordeal. Now his duty was to her. He looked at the three and shattered and broken people who remained in the room, his gaze lingering for a long and hard and deeply contemptuous moment on Tim's bowed head. He did not say a word to any of them. He simply turned and walked with a quiet and deliberate and purposeful stride towards the guest room that he and Amy had been using. A few moments later, he returned. In each hand, he carried a duffel bag. The message was as clear and as sharp and as final as a guillotine's blade. They were leaving. This house, this space, was no longer a home. It was enemy territory. Amy appeared in the doorway then, her face a pale and calm and unreadable and deeply and terribly and unnervingly composed mask. She walked over to the hook by the door and took her jacket. She did not look at her father. She did not look at her sister. She looked only at Lisa.
"We'll be at the ruin, if you need us."
Her voice was a quiet and flat and deeply emotionless thing. Lisa, her own face a mask of a quiet and elegant and bottomless sorrow, simply nodded, her eyes full of a universe of a pain and of a love and of a deep and profound and helpless understanding. "I know. You take care of each other." Amy and Ty walked out the door, and it closed behind them with a soft and gentle and terribly and profoundly and irrevocably final click. The sound was a punctuation mark, the end of a chapter, the end of a family, as they had once known it. The departure seemed to suck the last of the remaining oxygen out of the lodge. Lisa let out a long and slow and shuddering sigh, the sound of her own and very private and very deep and very weary heartbreak. She looked at Tim, a slumped and broken and pathetic figure in the armchair, and she looked at Lou, still frozen, a prisoner of her own and miserable and cowardly inaction. Lisa's voice when she spoke was not angry. It was just a deep and profound and soul-deep weariness. "I hope you're proud of yourself, Tim, both of you." She did not wait for an answer. She simply turned and walked, with a quiet and dignified and impossibly an elegant grace, towards her own room, leaving the father and the daughter alone in the toxic and silent and deeply miserable wreckage they had created. Lou felt a desperate and primal and childish urge to run, to flee the lodge, to flee the country, to flee her own skin. She could not bear the silence. She could not bear the sight of her father's collapsed and broken form. Most of all, she could not bear the terrible and burning and acidic weight of her own shame. She had stood there. She had listened to Amy's desperate and pleading and righteous accusations, and she had done nothing. She had said nothing. She had chosen the cowardly and easy and pathetic path of a silence, and in doing so she had chosen a side. She had betrayed her sister just as surely as if she had signed the contract with SC Capital herself. She finally forced her legs to move, her steps stiff and robotic, as she walked towards the sanctuary of her own room. She needed to be alone. She needed to think. She needed to breathe.
Lou!
His voice was a raw and broken and desperate and pleading croak from the armchair. She stopped, her back to him, her hand on the doorknob. She could not bring herself to turn around. She could not bring herself to look at him.
Don't you leave me too!
The words were a pathetic and selfish and deeply manipulative, and yet somehow a profoundly and terribly and childishly and heartbreakingly honest plea. He was a drowning man, and she was the last and flimsy and splintered piece of a driftwood within his reach. He had lost everything: his honor, his daughter's love, his wife's respect. All he had left was her, his last and reluctant and deeply miserable, and now completely and utterly and finally and truly and unwillingly and trapped ally. Lou did not answer him. She just stood there for a long and timeless and terrible and agonizing moment, her hand frozen on the doorknob. And then, slowly, and with the heavy and weary and defeated reluctance of a soldier accepting a battle she knows she cannot win, she let her hand fall away from the door. She turned, her own face a pale and drawn and miserable and deeply and profoundly and terribly unhappy mask. She was not going anywhere. She was trapped. The battle for her soul was just beginning, and the two and warring and deeply irreconcilable sides of her own and broken and shattered family were about to demand her final and absolute and terrible and soul-crushing allegiance. The next morning, a thin and gray and miserable light filtered through the large windows of the Dude Ranch Lodge, illuminating a scene of a quiet and domestic and deeply funereal devastation. The house felt like a tomb, a place where something vital and precious and irreplaceable had died the night before. Lou had not slept. She had spent the long and dark and terrible hours of the night staring at her ceiling, the final and terrible and silent scene of the previous evening, playing on a cruel and endless and repeating loop in her mind. Amy's empty and disappointed eyes, her father's broken and pleading whisper, her own and cowardly and shameful silence. She finally forced herself out of bed, driven by a desperate need for a coffee, for a routine, for any small and normal and mundane act that could serve as a temporary shield against the overwhelming and crushing and suffocating weight of her own reality. She found her father in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, a cold and untouched mug in his hands, staring out the window. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His face was a pale and gaunt and deeply haggard mask, the skin stretched tight over his bones, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He was a man who had been utterly and completely and finally broken by his own choices. He looked up as she entered, and a flicker of a desperate and pathetic and pleading hope ignited in his tired eyes. He had lost everyone else. She was all he had left. He began his pitch not with a shout, but with a quiet and weary and deeply defeated voice.
She's never gonna forgive me.
It was a simple statement of a fact, an acknowledgement of the terrible and permanent and self-inflicted wound he had created. Lou poured herself a coffee, her own movements slow and heavy, her back to him.
What did you expect?
I expected her to understand, to see the bigger picture.
He stood up then, a new and desperate and persuasive energy beginning to seep back into his voice. He was a salesman, making the most important and most desperate pitch of his entire life.
You see it, don't you, Lou? You have to. You're not like her. You're a businesswoman. You've run a company. You've been a mayor. You understand that sometimes, to save the thing you love, you have to make a hard and ugly and unpopular choice.
He moved to stand beside her, his voice dropping to a low and conspiratorial and deeply manipulative whisper.
Her plan. It's a beautiful story. It's a fairy tale. Amy and Ty and a pile of reclaimed lumber against a $10 million problem and a 1-year clock. It's sentimental and it's noble, and it is going to end with us losing everything. It is a child's dream, Lou. And we are the adults in the room. We are the only ones who are willing to face the cold and hard and brutal reality of the numbers.
He was framing it as a choice between a fantasy and a reality. between a childish idealism and a mature pragmatism. He was appealing to the part of her that he knew was her greatest strength and her greatest weakness, her deep and abiding, and sometimes overwhelming sense of a responsibility.
You lied to me, Dad. You lied to all of us. You went behind our backs and made a deal with the devil.
I didn't make a deal. I was exploring an option, the only viable option left on a table that was otherwise completely and totally and absolutely empty. I did it for you, for Amy, for Lindy, and for Katie, so that they would have a home to come back to.
His voice was rising now, full of that familiar and passionate and deeply self-serving and righteous fury.
This isn't about my lie anymore, Lou. It's about our future. It's about survival. You and me. We can still save this. We can still make the right deal. A smart deal. But we have to do it together. Because if we don't, if you choose her side, then it's all over. We lose. And Grandpa's legacy, the real one, the land, the home, it gets turned into a park for a bunch of apolarists. Is that what you want?
He had laid his cards on the table. It was a brutal and manipulative and deeply unfair choice that he was presenting to her. But a small and cold and pragmatic and deeply terrified part of her brain knew that he was not entirely wrong. The numbers, the terrible and cold and unforgiving numbers, were on his side. Later that morning, unable to bear the toxic and suffocating and deeply miserable atmosphere of the lodge for a second longer, Lou drove out to the ruin. She did not know why she was going. Perhaps it was an act of a penance. Perhaps she was seeking a clarity. Perhaps she just needed to see her sister. She found them working on the foundation, a small and silent and unified and deeply determined team of a two. The air at the ruin was clean and cold and smelled of a wood smoke and of a pine and of a hard work. It was a stark and beautiful and deeply painful contrast to the stale and poisonous and recycled air of a betrayal and a defeat back at the lodge. Amy looked up as Lou's car approached. Her face was a cool and distant and unreadable mask. There was no warmth in her eyes, no welcome, just a quiet and waiting and deeply wary stillness. Ty stopped his work and stood beside his wife, his own expression a mask of a quiet and cold and deeply unforgiving judgment. Lou got out of her car and walked towards them, feeling like a diplomat crossing a heavily mined and hostile and deeply contested border.
I wanted to see how you were.
The words were a lame and inadequate and deeply pathetic. Opening. Amy did not answer her. She just looked at her, her silence a more powerful and more damning and more painful indictment than any words could ever be. It was Ty who spoke, his voice a low and cold and quiet rumble.
We're fine, Lou.
Amy finally found her voice. It was not angry. It was not emotional. It was a quiet and clear and terribly calm and deeply and profoundly and heartbreakingly disappointed thing.
Why are you here?
I just talked to Dad. He's a mess. He thinks.
And what do you think?
The question was a sharp and clean and direct and unavoidable blade. Amy was not interested in her father's opinions anymore. She was only interested in her sister's. Lou looked from Amy's cold and unforgiving face to the blackened and skeletal and sacred ruin of their home.
I think it's complicated.
No, it's not.
Amy took a step forward, her own voice dropping, becoming a low and intense and deeply personal and heartbreakingly raw plea. This was not a business pitch. This was an appeal from the heart.
It is the simplest thing in the entire world, Lou. It is about right and it is about wrong. It is about a promise that we made to the one person who gave us everything. We are standing on his grave right now, and Dad wants to sell a piece of it to a corporate vulture to make his life easier. There is nothing complicated about that. It is a betrayal. It is a desecration. And I will fight him. I will fight you. I will fight the entire world before I let that happen.
She looked at her sister, her eyes, for the first time that morning, filling with a fresh and beautiful and deeply and profoundly and terribly sad wave of tears.
I always thought, that no matter what happened, it would always be you and me against the world, just like when we were kids. But you stood there last night, and you were silent, and your silence, it broke my heart, Lou. It broke my heart more than his lies ever could.
The words were a physical blow, a direct hit to the deepest and most sacred and most vulnerable part of Lou's soul. This was the true cost. This was the real choice. It was not between a business plan and a fairy tale. It was between her father's desperate and pragmatic and fear-driven logic and her sister's pure and absolute and unwavering and deeply and profoundly and now terribly and conditionally offered love. She stood there, whipsawed and shattered, and torn in two, a woman caught in the terrible and violent and destructive and deeply impossible crossfire of a war she did not start, but one that she now and irrevocably and terribly would have to finish. Lou returned to the Dude Ranch Lodge, feeling as though she had been flayed alive. Amy's words, a raw and beautiful, and deeply and terribly and heartbreakingly honest indictment of her own and cowardly silence, had stripped away the last of her defenses. She was no longer just a woman caught in the middle of an ugly family dispute. She was a traitor to the one and single and most sacred alliance of her entire life. She collapsed onto the sofa in the empty lodge, the profound and quiet and beautiful and sad memory of her sister's tear-filled eyes, a fresh and open and agonizing wound in her soul. Her heart, her entire being, screamed a single and clear and simple and absolute truth. Amy was right, morally, spiritually, thematically. Her father's plan was a desecration, a betrayal of everything their grandpa had stood for. Their only honorable path forward, the only path that did not spit on his grave, was the hard and noble and seemingly impossible one that Amy had chosen. In that moment, sitting alone in the quiet and sunlit and deeply unhappy room, Lou felt a flicker of a renewed and righteous and deeply sisterly resolve. She would go to her father. She would tell him it was over. She would choose her sister. She would choose honor. She would choose love. It was in this exact and fragile and beautiful and fleeting moment of a moral clarity that the sharp and intrusive and deeply unwelcome chime of her laptop from the dining room table announced the arrival of a new email. She ignored it at first, but it chimed again. A small and insistent and deeply annoying reminder of a world that existed beyond the raw and emotional and all-consuming landscape of her family's war. With a weary and resentful sigh, she pushed herself up from the sofa and walked to the table. The name on the screen made her breath catch in her throat. Mr. Thompson, the lawyer. A cold and sick and deeply premonitory dread washed over her, instantly extinguishing the warm and fragile and righteous flicker of her newfound resolve. Her hand trembled slightly as she moved the mouse and clicked the message open. The email was brief and professional and polite and as cold and as hard and as unyielding as a block of a granite. It was a simple and formal and legally necessary follow-up to their meeting. It outlined the official start date of the one-year probationary period as dictated by the will. It contained attachments, digital copies of the relevant clauses for their records, and it ended with a single and polite and utterly and completely and devastatingly chilling sentence. Please be advised that the forfeiture clause is absolute, and should the conditions of the trust not be met by the specified date, our firm is legally obligated to begin the transfer of the property to the Alberta Nature Conservancy without delay. The dry and emotionless and deeply impersonal legalese was a bucket of an ice-cold water thrown directly into her face. This was not a story anymore. This was not a moral dilemma. This was a contract, a binding and terrible and unforgiving legal document with a ticking clock and a catastrophic and irreversible and deeply and profoundly and terrifyingly real consequence for a failure. The emotional and heartfelt and deeply moral argument that had been raging in her soul was instantly and completely and utterly silenced. A different part of her, a colder and more pragmatic and more analytical and deeply mayoral part of her, took control. Her heart went silent, her head took over. She sat down at the table, her posture straightening, her expression becoming a mask of a cool and focused and deeply professional intensity. She needed data. She needed facts. She needed to see the enemy she was truly fighting, not in the emotional terms of a family betrayal, but in the cold and hard and brutal and unforgiving language of a numbers. She opened a new and clean and pristine spreadsheet, its empty and white and geometric cells, a stark and comforting and logical contrast to the messy and chaotic and deeply illogical landscape of her own heart. At the top of the first column, she typed a single and simple and deeply ironic word, assets. In the first cell below it, she entered the final and official number from the insurance payout. The number, which had once seemed so substantial, looked pathetic and small and deeply and horribly and laughably inadequate, sitting there all by itself. Then, she began to build the other side of the ledger, the much and larger and darker and more terrifying side. She spent the next 2 hours in a state of a pure and focused and deeply methodical and increasingly horrified concentration. She was no longer a daughter or a sister. She was a project manager, conducting a feasibility study on a project that was doomed to fail. She opened a dozen different browser tabs. She researched the average cost per square foot for a custom residential construction in their part of Alberta. She researched the cost of a commercial-grade barn construction. She made a list: foundation pouring, framing, roofing, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, septic systems, well drilling. Each item was a new and bigger and more terrifying number. She made a few and brief and ruthlessly efficient phone calls, her voice a calm and professional and deeply convincing instrument as she posed as a potential client, gathering preliminary quotes from contractors, from lumber mills, from well-digging companies. With each call, the number in her spreadsheet grew, the final tally in the bottom right corner of the screen climbing with a relentless and brutal and sickening velocity. She created a second spreadsheet. This one was for the timeline. A year, 365 days. It sounded like a long time, but as she began to plot it out, it shrank with a terrifying speed. She allocated weeks for architectural plans, for permit approvals from the county, for foundation work before the first, and hard and unforgiving winter frost. She factored in the inevitable delays, supply chain issues, weather, the simple and unavoidable and deeply frustrating realities of a massive construction project in a remote and rural area. The two spreadsheets side by side on her screen became a diptych of a pure and unadulterated and mathematical despair. The timeline was not just tight, it was a logistical nightmare, a perfect storm of a bad luck and a bad timing that would require a miracle to complete. And the budget was a catastrophe. She created a final cell at the bottom of her financial spreadsheet. She subtracted their total assets from the total projected cost. The number that appeared on the screen was a deep and bloody and horrifying and final red. It was not a small shortfall. It was a chasm, a vast and dark and deep and completely and utterly and hopelessly impassable financial abyss. It was in that moment that she finally and truly and completely understood. Her father was a liar and a coward and a traitor, and he was also and terribly and tragically and irrefutably right. It could not be done. Not this way. Not the way their grandpa had demanded. Not the way Amy's pure and beautiful and honorable and now completely and utterly and tragically and doomed heart so desperately wanted it to be done. Lou pushed her chair back from the table, a low and quiet and deeply defeated sound escaping her lips. She stared at the cold and blue and unforgiving light of the screen, at the numbers that did not lie, at the facts that did not have a heart. Amy's heartbroken and pleading and deeply moral words echoed in one ear, and the cold and hard and brutal and undeniable logic of her own research screamed a terrible and final and unforgiving truth in the other. Her head and her heart were at war, and her head had just been handed a terrible and powerful and seemingly and tragically and irrefutably and soul-crushing weapon. The numbers on the screen were a prison, a cold and logical and brutally efficient cage of facts and of figures that had trapped her, and suffocated her, and stripped her of all hope. Lou slammed the laptop shut, the sharp and angry and deeply final click of the plastic, a pathetic and inadequate expression of the screaming and helpless and terrified rage that was consuming her from the inside out. She had to get out. She could not breathe the stale and recycled and miserable air of the lodge for another second. She needed the wind. She needed the sky. She needed a space that was big enough to contain the vast and terrible and agonizing scale of her own torment. She drove, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her destination a foregone and deeply necessary conclusion. There was only one place to go: the ruin, the sacred and contested and deeply and terribly and beautifully hallowed ground zero of their entire and catastrophic family war. The sun was beginning to set as she arrived, casting long and dramatic and deeply sorrowful shadows across the wounded landscape. The air was cool and still, and carried the familiar and heartbreaking scent of a burnt wood and a cold ash. Amy and Ty were gone for the day, their truck absent from its usual spot. The site was deserted, a silent and poignant and deeply lonely monument to everything they had lost. Lou walked the perimeter of the foundation, her feet tracing the ghostly and invisible and deeply familiar outlines of a home that no longer existed. This was her Gethsemane, her lonely and windswept and terribly and profoundly and sacred garden of an agony. She stood in the spot where the kitchen had been, and she could almost smell the ghost of her mother's cinnamon rolls, a warm and beautiful and now impossibly and painfully distant memory. She looked at the great and blackened and defiant stone hearth, and she could hear the echo of her grandpa's quiet and rumbling and deeply comforting laughter as he told her a story on a long and cold and forgotten winter's night. Every memory was a sweet and beautiful and perfect and deeply painful and sharp and terrible knife in her heart. This was what Amy was fighting for, this sacred and intangible and priceless and beautiful thing, this legacy of a love, this soul of a place. And for a long and beautiful and heartbreaking moment, Lou's heart swelled with a fierce and pure and absolute and unwavering loyalty to her sister. She would not let this die. She would not betray these ghosts. And then she looked down at the crumbling and broken and fire-scorched concrete of the foundation beneath her feet, and the cold and hard and brutal and unforgiving voice of her spreadsheet whispered a terrible and insidious and undeniable truth in her ear. Foundation repair and pouring, estimated cost $150,000. She turned and looked out at the vast and empty and beautiful and deeply and terribly and achingly empty space where the great and iconic and deeply beloved Red Barn had once stood. And the voice whispered again. Barn construction, materials and labor. Estimated cost $800,000. Every warm and beautiful and sacred memory was being countered and canceled out and brutally murdered by a cold and hard and terrible and irrefutable number. Her heart and her head were locked in a mortal and vicious and deeply and profoundly and unwinnable combat on the sacred and ruined battlefield of her soul. It's a hard place to be, isn't it? Lou spun around, startled. Lisa was standing at the edge of the ruin, her own expression a mask of a quiet and deep and profoundly empathetic sorrow. She had approached so silently, so gently, that Lou had not heard her.
I didn't know you were here.
I saw your car. I was worried. Lisa walked over and stood beside her, the two of them looking out at the devastating and beautiful and heartbreaking landscape of their shared loss.
I don't know what to do, Lisa.
The words were a raw and quiet and deeply childish and exhausted confession. Lou's own and carefully constructed and capable and mayoral and deeply professional composure finally and completely and utterly crumbled, leaving only a scared and lost and desperately unhappy daughter.
I made a spreadsheet. I ran the numbers. It's impossible. What Dad says about the money, about the timeline, it's not just him being a cynical and pragmatic and infuriating jerk, it's the truth. The numbers do not lie. We cannot do this the way Amy wants to. We will fail, and we will lose everything.
She turned to her stepmother, her own eyes a mask of a pure and unadulterated and desperate and pleading and agonizing torment.
But Amy, if I choose his path, if I side with him, she will never ever speak to me again. I will lose her forever. I am standing here, and I am being asked to choose between my home and my sister, and I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to live with either choice.
Lisa was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant and beautiful and unshakable and deeply indifferent mountains. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a gentle and quiet and deeply loving and terribly and profoundly and devastatingly wise thing. You think this is a business problem. You're looking at your spreadsheets and you are trying to find a logical and pragmatic and financially sound solution. But you are wrong. Jack didn't leave you a business problem, Lou. He left you a family problem. She turned to face her, her own eyes clear and steady and full of a deep and absolute and unwavering and heartbreaking certainty. This was his last and greatest and most difficult test. He wasn't testing your ability to read a balance sheet. He was testing your faith in each other. He was forcing you, in the most dramatic and painful and difficult way possible, to choose what this family is actually about. Is it about the land, or is it about the love that was built on it? The question hung in the cool and still and evening air, a profound and terrible and deeply illuminating thing. It did not solve Lou's problem. It made it 1,000 times worse, because it clarified, with a brutal and absolute and devastating precision, the true and terrible and agonizing stakes of her choice. I can't tell you what to do. No one can. But you need to ask yourself one question. What do you think would break your grandpa's heart more? Watching his family lose this piece of land? Or watching his family lose itself? Lisa reached out and gave Lou's arm a single and firm and loving and deeply supportive squeeze. And then she turned and she walked away, leaving Lou alone once more in the deep and gathering and profound and absolute and terrible and lonely twilight. The stars began to appear in the deep and purple and darkening sky, cold and distant and indifferent, witnesses to her solitary and terrible and agonizing vigil. She stood there for a long and timeless and terrible moment, Lisa's words echoing in her soul. Lose the land, or lose her sister. Her father's desperate pragmatism, her sister's noble idealism, the cold and hard and brutal logic of the numbers, and the pure and absolute and unconditional, and now deeply and terribly and heartbreakingly endangered love of her only sister. She closed her eyes, and a single and hot and difficult and terrible tear escaped, tracing a path through the dust and the grime on her cheek. In the deep and profound and absolute silence of the ruin, surrounded by the ghosts of her past and the terrifying and uncertain and deeply and profoundly and horribly fractured landscape of her future, she finally and completely and irrevocably and terribly made her choice. A look of a grim and tragic and deeply unhappy and soul-crushing resolve settled over her features. She knew what she had to do, and she knew, with a certainty that was as deep and as true and as solid as the mountains themselves, that it was going to destroy them all. Lou drove back to the lodge under the cold and distant and indifferent light of the stars. The war inside her was over. A choice had been made, and the grim and terrible and deeply unhappy peace that follows a surrender had settled over her. She walked into the lodge, her face a pale and calm and resolute mask. Her father was still in the armchair, a slumped and miserable and waiting figure. Lisa was in the kitchen, a quiet and worried and sorrowful presence. Lou did not speak to either of them. She simply walked to the dining table, picked up her phone, and with hands that were now completely and utterly and terribly steady, she sent two and identical and deeply fateful text messages, one to her father and one to her sister. The message was 5 and simple and cold and unavoidable words. We are settling this now. An hour later, they were all assembled. The main lodge of the Dude Ranch, once a sanctuary of a warmth and of a laughter and of a love, had been transformed into a cold and sterile and deeply unhappy courtroom. The air was thick with a tense and miserable and suffocating and anticipatory dread. They had arranged themselves not as a family, but as two, and distinct and hostile and deeply entrenched, warring factions. Amy and Ty stood by the great stone hearth, their posture a silent and unified and deeply formidable wall of a moral certainty. Tim stood alone on the opposite side of the room, near the large window, a solitary and nervous and deeply isolated defendant. And Lou, she stood in the middle, in the vast and empty and terrible no-man's land between them, the reluctant and miserable and deeply unhappy judge and jury and executioner of her own family's fate. Lisa sat quietly on the sofa, a silent and sorrowful and deeply pained witness, the very conscience of the room. Lou took a deep and shaky and steadying breath. She looked first at her sister.
Amy, I want to start by saying that I am sorry.
Her voice was a low and raw and steady and deeply and profoundly and terribly and miserably sincere thing.
I am so sorry for my silence the other night. It was cowardly, and it was wrong, and you were right. It broke my heart to know that I broke yours. Nothing, and no one, is more important to me than you are. I need you to know that.
Amy's expression did not soften, but a flicker of a something, a tiny and fragile and deeply wounded spark of a hope ignited in her sad blue eyes. Lou then turned her gaze to her father. The warmth and the apology and the love instantly vanished from her voice, replaced by a tone that was as cold and as hard and as unforgiving as a winter stone.
And Dad, what you did, going behind our backs, lying to our faces, conspiring with men who would see this entire valley turned into a parking lot. It was a disgusting and dishonorable and unforgivable betrayal, not just of us but of Grandpa, and I will never ever respect you for it.
Tim flinched as if he had been physically struck, his own face a mask of a deep and pathetic and miserable shame. Lou had now, and finally and publicly, spoken her truth. She had sided with her sister's heart. She had condemned her father's actions. The tiny and hopeful spark in Amy's eyes grew brighter. And then, Lou delivered the blow that would extinguish that spark and all the light in the world, forever.
But
The single and terrible and devastating word hung in the air, a poison dart.
this isn't about what is honorable anymore. It's about what is possible. I have spent the entire day with the numbers, with the contracts, and the timelines, and the cold and hard and brutal and unforgiving facts of our situation. And the facts are this: Amy, your plan, as beautiful and as noble and as right as it is a fantasy. It is a mathematical impossibility. If we follow your path, we will run out of a time, and we will run out of a money. And according to the forfeiture clause that Mr. Thompson so kindly reminded me of today, we will lose Heartland. We will lose it all, forever.
She was speaking to Amy, but her words were for the entire room, a final and public and deeply unhappy presentation of her terrible findings.
Dad's plan, his methods, they were a betrayal. But his logic, his terrible and cynical and pragmatic logic, it is the only logic that adds up. It is the only path that ends with this family still in possession of this land. It is the ugliest and hardest and most heartbreaking choice I have ever had to make in my entire life, but the choice is to lose our home honorably or to save it dishonorably, and I cannot be the one who presides over the final and permanent and irrevocable end of Heartland.
She finally and completely ran out of words and out of strength. The tears that she had been holding back for so long finally and completely and irrevocably broke free, streaming down her pale and tormented and miserable cheeks. She looked at her sister, her own face a mask of a pure and absolute and pleading and desperate and agonizing and soul-crushing apology.
So I am choosing to pursue a financial solution. I am choosing the only path that I believe will work. I'm siding with Dad.
The terrible and final and irrevocable and soul-shattering words had been spoken. A profound and absolute and terrible silence descended upon the room. Tim did not look triumphant. He just looked old. A flicker of a grim and miserable and deeply unhappy relief washed over his features, and he bowed his head, a broken king who had just won his kingdom back at the cost of his entire world. Lisa closed her eyes, a single and silent and heartbroken tear escaping, a quiet and final admission of her own and profound and absolute defeat. But Amy did not cry. She did not scream. She did not move. She just stood there, by the cold and dark and empty hearth, and the tiny and beautiful and fragile and precious spark of a hope in her eyes did not just die. It was violently and brutally and completely and utterly and finally and truly and irrevocably and unforgivably and eternally extinguished, leaving behind only a cold and dark and vast and empty and bottomless and black and terrible and soul-shattering void. She stared at her older sister, at the woman who had been her partner, her protector, her other half for her entire life, and she saw a stranger.
I don't even know who you are anymore.
Her voice was not a shout, it was a whisper, a quiet, and dead, and hollow, and profoundly, and terribly, and tragically, and heartbreakingly, and finally, and completely, and utterly, and irrevocably, and devastatingly empty sound. She turned then, and Ty, his own face a mask of a cold and hard and absolute and unforgiving fury, put his arm around her, and they walked out. They did not look back. They did not look back. They did not say another word. They just walked out of the house and out of the room and out of the family, leaving the two and miserable and victorious and now completely and utterly and finally and truly and tragically and terribly and irrevocably and unforgivably and eternally and damnably and miserably and pathetically and horribly and victoriously and lost and broken and shattered and ruined and victorious. Partners, standing alone in the silent and terrible and self-inflicted and now deeply and profoundly and completely and utterly and finally and truly and victorious wreckage of their own making. The camera held on Amy's face as she crossed the threshold, a perfect and still and beautiful and terrible and heartbreaking and soul-shattering mask of a quiet and profound and absolute and final and complete betrayal. The family was not just broken anymore, it was dead.